Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about whither the G7 in the time of COVID. With the G7 summit approaching, we've assembled an expert panel to consider the G7's future and its ability to compete effectively with China in a post-COVID world. Joining us for this discussion will be George Washington University's Amitai Etzioni and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Jain. Our discussion will be moderated by our very own Ron Granieri. This event is part of the Robert Strausz-Hupé project, which examines the Atlantic system in a world of great power rivalry. For those of you who don't know Ron Granieri, he's the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of the West, and he's a Templeton Fellow this year for education. He's also a professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, which is why we will now do a obligatory disclaimer, which is that Ron's comments here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. Before I turn this over to Ron, I'd like to give a plug for a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow, June 10th at 2 p.m., we will have the annual Ginsberg-Sattel Lecture on American Character and Identity, featuring FPRI's Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Walter McDougall, who will be discussing the amazing career of Stephen Girard, Philadelphia tycoon and philanthropist. Again, that's tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. On Tuesday, June 15th at 2 p.m., we're going to be featuring our Eurasia program director, Chris Miller, discussing his new book, We Shall Be Masters, Russian Pivots to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin. And that will be moderated by Ron Granieri, who's also the host of our People, Politics, and Prose series. Finally, I'd just like to say a hearty thank you to those who are members, sponsors, and our board. If you're not in one of those groups, please consider becoming a member or a sponsor. We need your assistance. These events are free to you, but not free to us. Without further ado, one final reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be taking questions from the audience roughly halfway through the program. So again, thank you, and take it away, Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this special briefing, Whither the G7 in the Time of COVID. As we meet this afternoon, President Biden is about to embark upon his first major trip to Europe. Within the next week, the president will meet with European allies and partners in NATO and the European Union, concluding with a long-anticipated summit with Vladimir Putin in Geneva on June 16th. The trip will begin with the G7 summit of leading industrial democracies, scheduled to take place from June 11th to the 13th in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. Operating through annual meetings that rotate through the member states, the G7 has been coordinating economic policy among the major industrial democracies since its origins in the economic crises of the stagnant 70s. But the oldest established permanent floating summit in the world has no clear legal or organizational mandate. Its power largely rests as a forum for discussion and occasional announcement of policy intent. Over the past 2 decades, however, political leaders and analysts have asked whether the G7, either in its current form or through the addition of other partners, should take a more active role in promoting a policy agenda. The rise of China, which is not a member of the G7 and whose policies aim to challenge, if not undermine, the Western principles upon which the G7 was founded, offers one challenge to the organization. COVID, which exposed weaknesses in Western democracy's ability to handle crises, offers another, more recent challenge. In both cases, G7 members face uncomfortable questions about whether a Western social and political model of individualism and democratic governance is fit for the future, or whether that future belongs to China's illiberal vision. Time may be running short to respond. President Biden says the U.S. is back and expressed in a tweet this morning that he, quote, knows that democracies can rally together to meet the challenges of this new age, and that this week we have the chance to prove that. Gideon Rahman proclaimed in the Financial Times recently that this G7 conference is, quote, the West's last chance to lead. Is it? What can we expect from this G7 summit? What can the G7 learn from the COVID crisis? Is it possible or desirable for the G7 to play a more active role in supporting the larger values and political goals of the West? These questions and yours will guide us in discussion with our guests, Amitai Etzioni and Jain. Amitai Etzioni is a professor of international relations at George Washington University. His books include Reclaiming Patriotism, Avoiding War with China, and From Empire to Community. He has just launched a new platform for civil discussion, civildialogues.org. Jain is a senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where he oversees the Atlantic Council's Democratic Order Initiative and D10 Strategy Forum. He previously served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, focusing on U.S. alliances and partnerships, international norms, and challenges to the democratic order. Welcome to this discussion, Amitai Etzioni and Jain.
Thank you.
It's great to have you both here. I want to start, I want to turn to you, since you are, as someone who has been talking a lot about the G7, somebody who's been studying it for a while, is what role has the G7 played up to now in encouraging any coherent political agenda, and what kinds of possibilities exist for it to act in the future?
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Ron, for having me on today's panel. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to today's discussion on a very timely and important topic, especially as President Biden, as you mentioned, heads to Europe for the G7 summit. Well, the G7 itself has been around, as you mentioned, since the early 1970s, and its initial focus was on economic coordination among what it referred to as highly industrialized nations, basically the advanced economies of the world. Since then, it's become more attuned to focusing on both political and economic issues to varying degrees, and it has been a group that allows leaders to informally consult and present a coordinated approach, at least in the form of statements and communiques, and also a launching pad for new initiatives. What has been missing, and what we've been advocating, is that the G7 should be made into a group that is more focused on a mission that has to do with aligning democratic nations around shared values and common interests, not just in the forms of statements and the announcements of new initiatives, but rather focused strategic alignment and action. And then the other part of the reform that's required to the G7 has to do with who's at the table. We released a report yesterday, in fact, where we suggested that if the G7 is to be able to play the role that it needs to in galvanizing cooperation and rallying the democracies, as Joe Biden said, it needs to be reflective of the group of leading democracies that exists in the world today. And that includes countries from the Asia Pacific. We can talk a little bit more about who should be in this club and on what basis that needs to be organized. But before doing that, I think it's first important to talk just for a moment about the context, as you mentioned in your opening statement, that we're dealing with today. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the US and its allies now face a systemic challenge from autocratic rivals, particularly China and Russia, that are seeking to displace or disrupt the rules-based order that's been part of the international system for the last 7 decades. This is a new era of strategic competition. President Biden mentioned in his speech before the Munich Security Conference that we're at an inflection point between, quote, those who argue that the challenges are that autocracy is the best way forward, and those who understand that democracy is essential to meeting today's challenges, close quote. So the question really is, if this is the strategic landscape, how do we organize to deal with these challenges? And do we rely on entities that were set up decades ago, or do we design new entities that are tailored to the 21st century challenges that we're currently dealing with? What we've been contending is that one form of architecture that would help is to form a D10 that produces strategic alignment and coordinated action among like-minded democracies. The key here is like-mindedness, that if a group like this is to be successful, it has to consist of states that share a certain commitment to democratic norms and a certain worldview about the challenges facing the democratic world. And in addition, it has to consist of states that have global influence, those who have diplomatic, economic, and military capabilities to act on a global scale and to show and to demonstrate that by working together, their actions can make a difference. As one professor noted recently, it's really about bringing together the smallest possible number of countries needed to have the largest possible impact. And so we've suggested that in addition to the G7, it would be the criteria that I laid out would be met by other Pacific and Asia Pacific countries, including Australia and South Korea, with the European Union. That would bring the group to 10 members. Over time, other Asia Pacific nations such as India, others across the world, South Africa and Brazil, democracies that are rising in influence and in power over time could be considered for inclusion in this group, but that requires some degree of common understanding regarding strategic priorities and mutual expectations, particularly with regard to Russia and China, where there are still different points of view that could hinder like-mindedness and could get in the way of real action, hard-hitting action that the D10 could produce. So that's just a glimpse of what we discussed in this report that we released yesterday. There are a lot of questions that this raises in terms of how to build this kind of network and how to ensure that it has an agenda that can produce the kind of make the real difference in the world that we're dealing with today and with the challenges we're contending with, which we could get into more maybe during the Q&A.
Indeed. Well, and one follow-up before I bring in Amitai Etzioni, but Ash, in the past, or let's say in the last 20 years, right, when as the G7 emerged from the library group from 3 or 4 or 5, and then there was the idea, well, we need to bring in the Canadians, we need to make sure the Japanese are included, right? That the group got bigger. There were sort of economic reasons for this, and these were states that were already allies. And then, of course, we had the decision to include the Russians as a gesture towards the Russians to create the G8 briefly, right? The Russians even hosted one of these summits as a result of that. Then we have, of course, the Russians are excluded after Ukraine. There's also talk about creating the G20 as a different kind of organization that sort of goes beyond just these leading states. We have others, who talk about the G0 world, where there is no such group at all, but it's every state for themselves. The idea of such an organization that is itself informal and international. In the past, it's been able to have coherence because the states that belong to it sort of had some coherence, but they also weren't trying very hard to advance a common agenda. As soon as you try to advance a common agenda, there will be disagreements. And would moving from the G7 to the D10, or eventually to the D12, would that require this organization to formalize its organization and its sense of itself? Or is this just a matter of you bring in enough states who have a broad idea of what they're supposed to do and they will figure it out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what you pose, which is what's the outcome you're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. If it's simply to showcase kind of leaders coming together and demonstrating that they're sort of concerned about the same set of issues, and the result is a statement or a communique that expresses that, that's one thing, and that's a kind of low bar, and sometimes that's really all that's been expected of these kinds of summit meetings. But if we're expecting, or if we're eager to create an entity that produces effective action, and not just action at the tactical level, but strategic coordination, which is what's missing. If we're going to be dealing with a long-term challenge, a systemic challenge from China, or ongoing challenges from Russia, there really needs to be strategic coordination around a shared strategy for dealing with these challenges, so that the nations that are part of the group all are expected to carry their own weight and to combine their capabilities to deal with them. That's a tall order. It's not easy. There are differences, different points of view among the group. The US has a perspective, the Europeans have another, and individual members have different priorities and interests. So you're right to point out that this is much easier said than done, but it's also necessary for success. And that's why I think creating an expectation towards an outcome that matters is what really the purpose would be behind this. That also means a better or more structured way of organizing and operating. Informal leaders meetings, a dinner followed by a few hours of meetings and a statement. That's great. That's a good starting point. But there needs to be a lot more work done between these summit meetings with responsibility for producing the outcomes that we've laid out in advance. And that would mean, in our paper, we suggest that foreign ministers should be meeting regularly. They do in the G7 context, and they do make some attempt at coordinated policy approaches. But if an entity like this is to succeed, that responsibility needs to be made clear at the outset so that by the time you get to the summit, there is an expectation created for the kind of more effective and more influential actions that would come from these meetings.
And then there's the, if you can't beat them, join them argument, right? When you mentioned some of the states who would potentially be part of this D10 or whatever, you mentioned India, you mentioned South Africa, you mentioned Brazil. There was a time for the younger people in the audience, because that wasn't that long ago, but they can remember that when those states wanted to compete with the G7 by imagining themselves to be a separate group, the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? That somehow this was going to compete with the G7. And I don't want to get us too far off track here, but the idea that the BRICS concept didn't work out very well, or at least it has not been as coherent, in part because of perhaps different long-term visions of the members. And so would the G7 be opening the door to states who had initially thought of themselves as part of the BRICS? Is this a sort of a strategic chess move as well to keep the Chinese from building a club of their own?
I suppose you could think of it that way. As you mentioned, the BRICS itself was probably destined to kind of be a loosely organized group that really just is there to produce occasional meetings and leader summits, simply because there is very different interests among the groups that are the member states that are participating. I don't think there's any realistic chance that that's going to consolidate in terms of a separate block of sorts. So the D10 idea probably isn't so much aimed at thwarting those kinds of alliances from the Russians and the Chinese. They have very few allies, so to speak, of themselves. The Indians, even South Africa and Brazil, they have different concerns. India in particular has raised a number of challenges that it faces from China, including a live and active border dispute. So I certainly think that's going to hinder any kind of desire to align with China in the future. And then when it comes to other concerns about values and organizing for future challenges, it's the West. I think it's the US and its allies, its democratic partners that will be driving the action. And over time, we're likely to see both South Africa and Brazil also lean this way. The question is, how do we organize? Do we keep the door open? And our answer is yes, there should be an open door, because it's in our interest to cultivate their participation in groups like this in order to, again, both leverage common capabilities, but also demonstrate that this is an inclusive group. This isn't just a legacy of kind of transatlanticism that was the heart of the international order back in the Cold War.
Right, and that's good, because this opens the door for me to bring in Amitai Etzioni here on this as well. As what Ash is talking about is the idea that there should be sort of social, cultural, political visions that can act as unifying forces, but they're not, of course, identical. And the challenge within the West, broadly conceived, if I can speak in such broad terms, right? The West of an emphasis on individuality versus other cultures that emphasize communality. based on your lifetime of research on communitarianism, how would you characterize the current state of sort of this, what kinds of society, what kind of reactions to COVID in particular have revealed about different social models and their effectiveness in dealing with a problem like COVID, but also how well an appreciation of different social and cultural models can encourage the kind of political cooperation beyond the transatlantic space that Ash is talking about?
Well, thank you. I enjoy these kind of conversations, and I appreciate the opportunity that you gave us to have a conversation about what are really very crucial issues. So where I'm starting from is not what should be, because it always worries me that our aspirations will not be close enough to where historical trends are. So I like to start up where are the forces in play, and then see if we can tilt them a little. So that's my training goes that way.
Fair enough.
So what we saw before COVID is a rise of nationalism in practically all countries. Now there are some countries that haven't consolidated, like Afghanistan, but in all the Western, in Japan, in India, and that meant they already were retreating from the international order. And the most important, obvious example of this was Brexit. Britain driving to get itself out of the European Union. And within European Union, each one of the countries was in effect, because of migration and such, reasserting borders and national policies. Hungary and Poland just basically ignored the European Union, and so on and so on. Russia and China become more nationalistic. COVID vastly intensified that process. And you can see it very much in what happened with vaccines. Each country hogged the vaccine for itself. I mean, those who have them. And even European Union, which originally talked about shipping them outside, say, oh, no, we keep them for our country. And countries, there's no collaboration. There's a little sideshow. But the major force is, next up in economic policies, President Biden very much picked up the Trump idea of breaking international supply lines, relying more and more on domestic production and industrial policy. And so what we see now is no movement back to serious international collaboration, but greater emphasis on building things at home economically, first of all. Finally, and as President Biden says twice a day, we want to build democracy, which again, domestically. So first of all. Second, something very odd thing happened. Historically, nationalism was a way to unify a country. Sometimes it was very harsh and chauvinistic. Sometimes it was more benign in Norway and Canada. But it always served as a call for unity in the name of the fatherland, in the name of nation. This time, not only we are breaking whatever international order there was by retreating into the nation, but within each nation we have greater fragmentation. So we have United States polarization. We can go to all the countries. In all of them, a greater divisiveness, and as a result, more difficult to govern. So for me, the first question is, for the future of the West democracy, how can we rebuild a sense of community, first of all, within each country? So we don't have this right-wing extreme populism, the left minor, similar, hard left, and above all, this tearing apart, this intranational tribalism. So these are the two major social forces worldwide. So now, what about China? I belong to the 3 last people left who, in the United States, who see China very differently, maybe 2. I must introduce that the economists have said that only brave people in the United States are doves. So I give myself a quiver. I'm brave. I don't think China is out to eat our lunch. and neither capable nor intention. Not all authoritarian countries are expansionists. Not all authoritarian countries have messianic ambition. Singapore doesn't. Vietnam doesn't. So you can be a very vicious, but China clearly is brutal, authoritarian regime without necessarily international aggressive ambitions. If you define aggression the way the United Nations does, out to occupied countries to dominate and such. So I see China as like this. It's seeking to be respected after it's been humiliated by the West for 300 years. It seeks to have influence around country, around its border. It wants, like, by the way, Russia, it doesn't want United States military bases on all its borders. It has the old-fashioned notion of sphere of influence. But by the way, we of course do. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We would be very troubled if China would set up military bases in Mexico. But we somehow don't mind if we put them all around, and we're urging India and Japan and everybody and Taiwan now to build more and more arms and more armies. So finally, China is completely dependent on the import of resources, raw material and energy. So the Silk Road is very much an attempt to make more land passes so China can secure the flow of raw material. It has a huge amount of domestic problems. It's a rapidly aging population, terrible pollution, terrible environmental problems, running out of water, a youth which is completely rebelling against all this stuff, much more interest in consumerism, have no interest in ideology or party or in this stuff. So while at the moment China is riding high, it has neither the intention nor the capability of becoming a world power.
Well, so, let me interject there, because I think this gets to an interesting question for both of you, and that is when we talk about the possible challenge of China, the challenge that it poses. Certainly, if we think of traditional hard power, if the Chinese were to say move against Taiwan, whenever, that would be a hard power action, an aggressive action, as you describe in the terms of the United Nations. But does the very success, the apparent current, we can say short-term, perhaps illusory, economic success of China, which offers then, which China then touts as a result of its anti-democratic, authoritarian, illiberal political model. The very success of China, whether the Chinese are aggressive or not, this poses a challenge that would require some kind of response. And how should democratic states, so beyond the typical transatlantic club, as Ash has been talking about, how, if at all, should democratic states offer a counter narrative without themselves then being accused of somehow warmongering or creating a Cold War or any of the sorts of things, right? How do you respond to let's say, we don't have to say China is a threat, but even if China is a challenge, how do you respond to a challenge like that in a way that doesn't get one accused of stirring up controversy? I'll go to you first, Amitai, and then you, Ash.
Maybe I can answer very briefly.
Yeah,
I agree that fixing up the democracies and making them the shining city is the best way. And we now decided, you know what, we also can give country vaccines. Mm-hmm. So that's a very constructive answer to the Chinese push. And we said, we're not going to ask anything in return. Well, very well. So, but more seriously, I don't know, again, I don't follow everything. I don't know a single country, not a small country, which said, you know, I like the China model, we're going to dump democracy and adopt the Chinese model. Where's that country? So
I say Viktor Orban decided to dump Central European University because it was connected to George Soros, and has instead accepted a huge investment from China to build a university in Budapest.
Well, okay, that's one university.
I'll throw that out there.
But talk about countries. Mm-hmm. Hungary was going its own semi-fascist way without China. And so it gives China much power to say, and he's not imitating the China model, he's imitating the Soviet model. And so, but anyhow, I don't see any better way than fixing up our own house. But that's not, you cannot do that if you keep increasing the military budget and don't have money for the other projects. And while the Biden at the moment is riding high, I think the Biden era is almost over. And so the notion that he'd be able to fix the democracy, a lot of the work would be left for whoever follow him. And again, which from my viewpoint is not inconceivable, is going to be what they call a competent Trump. Right. So if you want to worry about competing with China, there is no better way to building up things at home. Arranging forgive me, that's not my shtick, my role. Arranging the chairs between the 7, 8, 9, 10. This is arranging the chairs on the Titanic.
All right. Well, ask Jain, as an architect of stately ocean liners in international politics, what do you think about this argument that if you want democracy to succeed, you make democracy succeed, whatever organizations you create? But how do you see, is there a symbiosis between broadening the types of cooperation between democracies of different types and also encouraging democracy in itself?
Well, before answering that question, let me just address the conversation on China, because China is the context here that we're dealing with globally and is animating part of the rationale for why it's so important now at this moment to find ways to organize more effectively. And while I agree with part of Amitai's argument that China is very different, certainly, than the kind of threat and challenge that the Soviet Union presented to the world and to the world order. China, nevertheless, still is not a benign force. It's not kind of neutral when it comes to the values and the norms and the rules that we've been propagating for the past 7 decades. Rather, it has its own vision of how the world should operate. And that vision is incompatible in many ways with Western liberal democracy, especially when it comes to starting at home. China has obviously a very different way that it's organizing its own society. We can look the other way and be quiet about it. But when the Uyghur population is being subjected to what many think is a genocide, and when Hong Kongers are having their democratic freedoms taken away, when Taiwan is under threat constantly because we don't know how the Chinese will react since they consider it part of their territory, and when the Chinese population themselves, are cut off or subjected to restrictions on their own freedoms, that matters. And it matters not just because we're concerned about the state of democracy generally. It matters because the Chinese see any commentary about that situation at home as an affront on their sovereignty. And so that itself creates this kind of systemic pressure on China to look for where it can push back on any kind of criticism. And they're using their economic influence to make sure that that interest is being advanced, whether it's the NBA and the way basketball players have to be careful about how they talk, or companies engage in business transactions. It begins from there, and it leads to policies that China's taken to the next level: economic coercion, coercive practices against allies like Australia. It's about the way in which China is looking to order itself and spheres of influence that it feels it has a prerogative to engage in. And I'm not even to talk about the military side, where air defense zones and the South China Sea activities have demonstrated more of a kind of an expansionist view of the world. That said, it's a threat and a challenge that is much different than what we faced during the Cold War, and requires a more nuanced and tailored approach, and also one in which we have a clear interest in avoiding confrontation and a kind of Cold War dynamic. China is connected and integral to the global economy in ways that rivals never were before. So there's a systemic challenge here that is real and that requires organizing around. And then to your point about democracy at home versus democracy abroad, of course, doing better at home, showcasing the benefits and the success of our own democracies should be at the top of our priority list. It's in all of our interests and the citizens of our nations to do so. But again, those are one of those everlasting tasks and challenges. We're never going to reach a stage of perfection. We have a lot of problems to deal with, certainly as the last 4 years have exposed here at home. So we have a lot of work to do at home in terms of rebuilding our own democracies, but we can do both at the same time, engage at home, but also deal with the challenges from abroad.
Well, and that is a hopeful way to put it, and it's worth exploring also in light of this question from Jerry Rubenstein, who's actually posted 2 questions in the Q&A that relate to a similar the problem of, or the, let's say problem might not be the right word, but let's say the challenge posed by Chinese economic and technological advances, right? That as China leads in technology such as 5G or quantum computing, as they try to position the yuan as a digital currency, they seem to be interested in undermining the reserve currency of status of the dollar. They control the marketplace of 2 billion people, which of course gives them enormous leverage, which means that when they feel politically threatened or challenged, right, they can get the attention of the NBA, get the attention even of John Cena, and get him to abjectly apologize. And when you consider that each of the current members of the G7, each has their own relationship with China, and the EU tries to have a relationship with China, that is Chinese economic power in itself so influential, let's say, and so corrosive, because if the Chinese want to pull hard on those strings, they can pull members of the G7 apart from each other. Is it realistic to imagine that the G7's model of democratic capitalism can continue to function if the Chinese are able to pull on the capitalist part to pull people away from democracy? I'll start with you, Ash, and then I'll go back to you, Amitai, on this.
Yeah, well, let me take part of that question, which has to do with how the Chinese could make it difficult for coordination through, whether it's the G7 or the D10, because they have such enormous influence on individual member states, economic influence particularly. And that's a reality that has been made clear from many of the particularly European G7 members that they're concerned about. They don't want to be part of a club or an alliance that feels like it's directed against China or that could jeopardize other interests, including commercial interests. And so there's a need to be quite careful about what exactly these coalitions are all about. I wouldn't see them as oriented against China or any other nation explicitly. I mean, the entities we're talking about are geared towards advancing shared values and common interests. In some cases, those are going to run up against other visions of the world, including the Chinese and the Russians. But it's not about forming a security alliance or a coalition that's geared towards containing China or Russia. And I think that's important to start with. But that said, we're seeing that debate play out within European, and even here in the US to some degree, but certainly more in Europe, where the strategic community sees the challenge a different way from the economic community, and political leaders are kind of caught between trying to figure out where they want to position themselves in their countries. Already Europe has come a long way in recent years in terms of seeing the Chinese challenge more similarly to the way the US and those in allies in Asia have been seeing it for a while.
Very good. Thanks, Ash. And Amitai, as you respond to that question, I also want to push you again to talk a little bit about how different conceptions of community within democracy may function or not function to encourage greater cooperation, say, between European, North American democracies and East Asian democracies, how that has worked in the past and how that can work in the future.
Well, let me first of all agree with Ash that certainly we should not keep quiet about the vicious things which are happening inside China. Mm-hmm. I think the term genocide is inappropriate, but we're arguing about a term. But we should not hold back in any way in terms of our statements. We should also recognize that we've been lecturing countries all over the world about human rights since the invention of human rights, and it doesn't have a lot of effect. But it doesn't mean we should be silent. Mm-hmm. But we have to, again, I think we should not get caught in our own rhetoric and fall prey to our own propaganda. So yes, we should make the statement, but also recognize they're not going to make a lot of difference. Second, I believe that China does want to revise the international order, but that doesn't mean that's the end of the conversation. We created that order in 1945 when we were the only standing power. We set up the rules, and now comes a huge power, and we say, oh, it has to be exactly the way we set it up. Don't you even dare ask changing it. Well, that's not a way to engage in power. For instance, the Chinese interest in free trade. So what happened is we used to be the big champion of free trade, but we are now protectionists. The Chinese, first of all, let's go to the Obama administration. The Obama administration created a free trade zone leaving out China. Well, they tried to divide the world into two camps. Then we set up huge tariffs, which every economist I know say it's harming us more than the other side. So first of all, what is China calling for is free trade? I don't see any reason we should object to that. China has made suggestions about new rules about how we should conduct ourselves in outer space. If you read that statement they made and did not know where it came from, you would think it was made by the Brits. The Chinese on technology, again, we can go on and on. I think we should have a conversation with them about the international order and be willing to revise some things. On WTO, we put them to 15 years of hoops they had to jump through till we admitted to them. Now, when they won 2 cases, we suddenly say, oh, we don't like WHO anymore. So let's be open about it. We want an international order. We should engage with China. It doesn't mean we should accept their vision at all. I think part of what the suggestion is perfectly subject to our discussion. Now, to go back to your question, we are not ready strategically to build transnational communities. What we really need is obvious. We need to take some of the hard feeling people have, perceive themselves as tribes, and move some of that loyalty to the international community so we can deal with climate, so we can deal with human trafficking. All these issues are transnational, global, and we cannot deal with them on a national level. But we have not begun to find a way to transfer that very deep identity people have with their nation to a higher level, and the failure of the EU to do so. It shows you, if you cannot do it for 27 countries, how can you hope to do it for the global community? And put it in some very sharp terms. There are millions of people who are willing to volunteer to die for their country. And not one will die for the United Nations. And so it's just a very simple way to illustrate. The Germans have made huge sacrifices, 100 billion a year for 10 years for the East Germans because they're Germans. That's all you have to say. The moment you ask them to give $5 to the Greeks, they say, oh my God, no. So basically what you come down to is tell me how you move at least some of that loyalty, some of this sense of identity to the global community. That's where we need to be.
Right.
Because
well,
then we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Well, but I will say that, there was a time, I guess, going in the 19th century, right? There was a time that evangelists for free trade argued that free trade would do exactly that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And indeed, of all the things, Marx was terrible on predicting what communism would be like, but he described capitalism quite well in the 19th century when he described it as the goal is, right, to break down all old prejudices, right? All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profane. And yet at the same time, right, what we're talking about right now is, and even when the Chinese say they're in favor of free trade, right, they imagine a world in which trade can be free, but people are not. And how exactly?
No, I'm sorry. Why do you think they imagine the world?
Well, let's just say they're hoping they want to have maximum free trade without making their own people free. Is the point that I'm saying?
Regime in other countries.
Well, and I guess that's what I guess that's the point I'm trying to get. It's a philosophical one. I'm not advocating regime change anywhere, but I'm saying that the idea that capitalism, because it was encouraging the free flow of information as well as the free flow of capital, that this was supposed to encourage individual freedom. And yet the Chinese model is at least trying to say, well, at least here we can build a society where there's plenty of freedom and we want global free trade, but we want to be able to restrict certain other freedoms within the territories we control.
Yes.
And we also want those restrictions to be respected and even endorsed by anybody else who wants to participate in free trade. I wonder, are we turning on its head, right? The idea that capitalism was going to liberate by encouraging freedom. And now we're being told that, well, in the name of capitalism, we have to accept the fact that some people are not going to be liberated. And some people are never going to be free because it'll cost us too much money if we talk to the Chinese, if we actually interfere with the economic flows, that we have to somehow keep the Chinese happy so that we can keep the economy running. And if that means some people end up unfree, that's not our problem. I mean, because I guess this is exactly, if the goal is to encourage people to feel a kind of devotion to a transnational humanity, how do we do that if we don't actually impose a cost for those who violate the rights of other people in humanity? I'm going to go to Ash first, then I'll go back to you, Amitai, on this. What do you think about that, Ash?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and it is pertinent here to how do you organize to deal with these challenges, because these are not just tactical coordinating bodies. They reflect, in order to be successful, they have to reflect a common worldview and a common sense of identity, which is a term I think both of you were talking about here with regard to how to organize international institutions. Sure, there isn't a sense of common identity when it comes to the UN, but there has in the past been very clear a common sense of identity among nations that were facing similar challenges. During the Cold War, the common sense of identity was around the notion of the free world or the transatlantic alliance. And there was a lot of effort made by political leaders to suggest that we're all in this together, that we have a common frame of reference, and that we need to be aligned in pursuing common goals. I think that's what's needed today, but oriented around not the threat so much as the common sense of identity as free people, as democracies that share the same values, that share the same goals for how the world should be organized. And it's on that basis that if our leaders continue, or if political leaders make the case for that, and I know President Biden is doing that nearly every day. I mean, his Washington Post op-ed talks about rallying the world's democracies to a common cause. He's framing the issues around this kind of narrative, and that kind of building of a sense of identity will be critical if these kind of entities can really make a difference. So I would start there as a point of reference. This question about China, of course, is and its view of the world order and the future is one that is being debated very actively, as we're seeing today, and among scholars. I certainly see different points of view. I think it's not entirely clear, even by the Chinese, or at least in their expressions of their intent, where they want to go with this. But we're just seeing inclinations as to the kind of global order that they're pushing. And we're seeing clashes in terms of how that order conflicts with our values. And we haven't talked about areas of technological innovation, advanced technologies, where there are no norms haven't been developed yet. Mm-hmm. When dealing with genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and the like. And I think there's a real danger here that if things continue down the trend lines, the Chinese could be first to market for some of these technologies, and they can shape rules that are inconsistent with our own vision. So that's why having coordination first among the allies, among democratic allies, is important on issues like this, but also to have a place to talk about those rules and norms with China and with other global powers, so that maybe there's a way to reach some accommodation. is also important. So it's not one or the other. I think there's a way to dual track this kind of approach to global order building.
That's fair. Well, Amitai, if I come back to you on this as well, you raise an excellent point that that however long it's taken since in the post-war era, right, that people still have their attachment to their national identities, maybe to slightly larger regional identities. A question of who, because I see James Thompson asked the question, right? What exactly is free trade and who oversees it, right? The answer is, of course, well, nobody, right? I mean, it's, that my invisible hand is supposed to be overseeing that. But this gets to an issue of who oversees it is, let's say, vorausgesetzt, right? That encouraging people to think of broader transnational identities is a good idea, right? I may happen to think that, you may happen to think that, people watching may happen to think that. But if it's a good idea, who has, or what individuals or organizations have the legitimacy and let's say the right, or however you want to put it, because some people get very allergic to the idea that some organization is going to tell them they have to put aside their national identity. So who's supposed to tell them that, and why should anybody listen to them?
So interesting example is what happened to the climate.
Yeah.
So I'm often asked when I teach my sociology classes, how you change society, which is kind of question you ask. And I always tell my students that I appreciate that finally you ask me an easy question because there's only one answer. And so, it makes it easier for me.
That's nice.
The only way you had major changes in history, in modern history, is social movements. So if you had the environmental movement in the United States, which forced Nixon to set up the Environmental Protection Agency, right, and pass the first laws in protecting the environment. We had a civil rights movement, which had enormous effects. There's a long way to go. We have recently the Black Lives Matter movement, which has international effects. And so on. I can give you many more examples. Nationalism itself is often the result of a social movement. So what we're beginning to see is some transnational social movements. Protecting the climate is one of them. And they are pushing the governments toward collaboration. So there you have a genuine social force, which has some bite and strength, and it can push politicians in very many different countries, including China, by the way. One of the things that China, what happened to China is the odd thing. They made half the country into middle class, the other half is still very poor. But the middle class, instead of being very satisfied by kind of having their income tripled and have all this apartment in Shanghai and such, they say, now we also want good services. We want good health, we want good education, and we want clean environment. We don't want this pollution. And so even in China, you have a genuine domestic environmental pressures. So the degree that can we find more of these things, where we have issues which can get people excited across nations, so they form these informal networks of social movements, we may begin to move in that direction. But let me say, before we run out of time, the most important thing I suggest, instead of starting with what I wish list, I think we should start, where are we? Where are the trends going? And then say, how can we redirect them? Because otherwise, I went to a meeting and say, we want everybody to have music appreciation. Fine, tell me how to do that. So I think we need a little more realism and a little less optimism.
I like this, for a little bit of realism, a little bit of optimism. Ira Strauss has a question that combines the two, if you will. And that is that he says that he's seen recent articles by Professor Etzioni on what we need to learn from the communitarianism of the more democratic East Asian countries on matters such as combating COVID. He wonders how Western countries could proceed with doing this practice. In other words, learning from these East Asian communitarian models, and whether there's a connection between that kind of learning and Ash Jain's ideas on upgrading the East Asian presence in the G7. I'm going to go with you, Ash, first, and then we'll go back to Amitai, please.
Yeah, well, look, I think the response, the COVID response in East Asia is an important lesson to look at. What happened there was that the East Asian democracies responded very positively early on to the COVID crisis, the pandemic, in very different ways and very successfully compared to other democracies, including the United States and Europe. And the question is, what led them to create the conditions for that early success? I think it's worth taking a look at because the narrative that China has been trying to suggest is that they did it better, that the autocratic model is better suited for the kinds of global challenges we're going to face. Look at the pandemic. You know, they responded quickly to shut things down. You need a kind of a hard approach that autocratic governments can provide to making people comply with these rules because they're restrictive by their nature. Restrictions on movements and lockdowns, tracing people's whereabouts, all the things that are required to get people to comply with masking and take vaccines. That's something that autocrats, I think, can say they can do a better job at. And yet we have the model early in the crisis from Eastern Europe, from East Asian democracies, where their populations were responsive to governmental measures to do these same things, but in a way that's consistent with democratic values. We ultimately, I think the story will be that the West, the US, Europe, also eventually came around. We're on a good pathway, positive pathway to dealing with the crisis. But there was a lag time there that shows that maybe there are some advantages that that countries like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, even New Zealand were able to organize around better, which could be lessons learned for other democracies as well.
Right. Well, one could argue that, right, an authoritarian society tells people what to do. In a democratic society, it's better when people want to do something, right? So it makes it possible for them to do it. So Amitai, Etzioni, in the last couple of minutes we have left, right, this is the question, right? Is how do you encourage a society to have people to want to be part of a community? If we agree that that's where we want to go.
Wonderful to go to close on a note of a complete agreement. I think Japan is the place to look. Mm-hmm. Japan, the government role was actually minimal, but they have a very strong social fabric. They're very communitarian, if you want to use that term. And as a result, once the government explained what needs to be done, people, by and large, did voluntarily. They shame some people, which is we don't like to do, but it's a very communitarian way. In the end, leave the decision to the person being shamed, but it tells you what society expects of you. So, and again, no, they did not do perfectly because the pandemic is so vicious. It breaks all barriers, and by the way, it's also back in China. Mm-hmm. But the model we should look for is in New Zealand and Japan, and we have nothing to be embarrassed about if we do what they do, restore our social fabric.
Mm-hmm. Restore our social fabric. We want to build a community where free people can express their ideas, can sometimes disagree, can sometimes agree, but that the mutual, let's say the mutually respectful exercise of freedom enriches us all. Much like this discussion, I hope, which was mutually respectful and full of lots of nuggets of wisdom that we managed to enrich. I know I certainly feel enriched by this conversation. I hope that our audience does too. I want to thank you, Amitai Etzioni. I want to thank you, Ash Jain, for joining us today for this FPRI special briefing.
Well, thanks very much. It's been great to be here with you.
Thank you. And
good meeting.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I thank all of you who've been listening and watching for your questions. We were able to get to a lot of them. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every possible question, but I hope that you found some enjoyment in the discussion that we've had. FPRI thanks our sponsors and partners for their generous support for this program. We thank all of you for joining us, especially for those of you who are interested in the Strausz-Hupé project on the Atlantic community in a world of great power competition. addition, we encourage you to consider how you can support this work this year and in the years to come, because today's conversation is really just the beginning. We here at FPRI are constantly looking for new ways to discuss, to debate, to understand our contemporary world. If you have enjoyed our conversation today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time while we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of like this one at FPRI and other events, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program at Ronald Granieri. But until we meet next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.